Simone Ikebe was 37 years old, and on the night of her own engagement party, standing 4 feet behind her fiancé in a hallway that smelled of gardenias and catered food, she heard the sentence that changed everything. She was the kind of woman people described as understated. She drove a decade-old Civic that she kept meticulously clean. She wore the same pearl earrings her grandmother had left her to every occasion that called for jewelry, including tonight. Her colleagues at the Memphis logistics firm where she managed operations called her thorough. Her fiancé, Derek Odom, called her steady, which she had always taken as a compliment. His friends called her Quiet Simone, and he had never once corrected them. She had been engaged to Derek for 6 weeks, and the party at his colleague's house in Germantown was his idea, a celebration for the people in his world. And she had agreed because she loved him, and because she had spent 3 years building a life alongside him, and believed that what she was building was real. She had stepped into the hallway to retrieve her cardigan from the coat room when she heard Derek's voice around the corner, low and loose with the confidence of a man who believed himself unobserved. He said, laughing softly, "She is going to make me rich. Man, her family's got money she doesn't even talk about. I've been patient. Give it another year, and we're set." The man he was speaking to said something Simone did not catch. Derek said, "She trusts me." That's all I needed. What Derek had never thought to ask, not once in 3 years, was why a logistics manager drove an old Civic to a firm where she had restructured the entire freight division and added $3 million to annual throughput. He had never asked whose name was on the property trust her grandfather had established, or why her attorney called her quarterly instead of waiting to be summoned. He came to that engagement party believing he was 2 steps from the finish line. He was right that a finish line was coming. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning of the party had started quietly, the way Simone preferred mornings to start. She had been up before the sun, moving through the kitchen of the Midtown bungalow she had bought at 29 and renovated board by board over the following 2 years. She had laid the backsplash tile herself over a long Thanksgiving weekend, a herringbone pattern in matte white that her grandfather had called precise and beautiful when he visited the following spring. He had been a contractor for 40 years, and when Ernest Ikebe said a thing was well made, it meant something. She stood at the kitchen counter now with her coffee and looked at those tiles and let the morning settle into her the way it always did when she was in this house, this particular room, this particular light. Her grandfather used to say, "Simone, a person who knows what they have built does not panic when someone tries to take it." She had heard that saying in the context of houses and contracts and disputes with developers. She had never imagined she would need it for a marriage. Ernest was 81 now, sharp and slow-moving in equal measure, still living in the house in Orange Mound where he had raised her mother and her aunts. She called him every Sunday. He was the person she had called first when Derek proposed, and he had paused in the way he paused when he was deciding whether to say the careful thing or the true thing. And then he had said, "That man asks a lot of questions about the property trust." She had told herself it was just grandfather caution. She had not written it down or turned it over in her mind. She had let it settle into a drawer she did not open. She had met Derek at a professional conference in Nashville 3 years ago, one of those evenings that begins as an obligation and becomes something else. He had been presenting on supply chain risk management, and he had done it well, with a clarity and a dry humor that she respected. They had talked for 2 hours over bad conference wine, and she had thought, this one pays attention, which was the thing she valued most. He had paid attention in those early years. He had asked about her work and listened to the answers. He had come to Memphis and walked through the bungalow and said, "You did this yourself?" And she had said, "Most of it." And he had looked at the tile and the restored trim and the refinished floors, and something in his expression had shifted in a way she had read as admiration. She understood later what it had actually been. He came into the kitchen at 9 that morning, moving with the easy energy of a man in a good mood, already dressed for the party, though it was hours away. He kissed her cheek and complimented the coffee and asked whether her cousin Adeze was coming tonight, casual and light. And Simone said yes, and watched him take the information with a small nod that landed differently than it once would have. Adeze was the one in the family everyone knew was well-positioned. Simone had heard Derek bring up her cousin in conversation more times than the situation ever called for. She had filed that detail without examining it. She noticed, as he took his phone from the counter, that the screen was already face down before he reached for it. She had noticed that for several months. Only her attorney and her grandfather knew the full picture of what Simone Achebe actually held. And neither of them had been asked to keep a secret. They had simply never been asked the question. The party had been running for 2 hours when Simone slipped into the hallway for her cardigan. She heard Derek before she saw him. She stopped at the corner and stood still and listened to every word with the practiced attention of a woman who had spent 15 years managing freight systems where a missed detail meant a missed shipment, and a missed shipment meant a broken contract. She heard it once. She did not need to hear it twice. Her face remained perfectly calm. She retrieved her cardigan. She returned to the party. She poured herself a glass of water and spoke pleasantly to 3 different people about the food and the flowers and how well the evening had come together. She laughed at the right moments. She stood beside Derek when he put his arm around her and said something warm to a group of his colleagues, and she smiled the way she had always smiled when she was in rooms where she was performing for an audience that did not know it was an audience. She drove home that night and sat in the driveway for 4 minutes. Then she went inside and opened her laptop. The system she used for freight auditing was second nature to her. Start at the beginning. Build the timeline. Don't skip steps. Verify everything. She applied it now to 3 years of a relationship with the same methodical patience she brought to any problem that needed solving, rather than reacting to. A logistics director did not curse the broken chain. She traced it back to where it first gave way. She began with the financial conversations she could document. Derek had borrowed $11,000 from her over the course of the relationship, framed as short-term gaps, repaid in part but never in full. She had not pressed it because she had not needed the money, and she had trusted him. She had the transfer records in her bank statements going back 31 months. She printed every page. She went to the emails next. Derek had an account he used for professional correspondence, and one she believed was personal, and she had access to neither. But she had her own records and her own memory, and she was a logistics director who understood that patterns were always visible if you knew what unit of measurement to apply. A discrepancy in one column always pointed to a discrepancy in another. She pulled the calendar entries for the past 18 months and cross-referenced them against the trips he had described as work travel. She found 4 weekends where the cities he named did not align with the conferences she could verify through industry listings. She noted each one with the date, the stated destination, and the discrepancy. She found 2 hotel reward notifications forwarded to a secondary email address linked to his professional profile, an address she had not known existed until she looked for it specifically. She did not guess at what filled those weekends. She did not need to. She also went back through her own memory of the engagement period and found 3 conversations in which Derek had, with the subtlety of someone who had done this before, steered discussions toward the property trust, toward her grandfather's health, toward Daisy's assets and how they were held. She had answered those questions the way people answer the questions of someone they trust. She had answered them honestly and completely. She sat with that recognition for a long moment before she wrote it down without emotion and added the note to the folder. Her hands did not shake. Her face remained perfectly calm. She opened a new folder on her desktop. She named it simply Odom. She picked up her phone and sent a single message to a contact saved under the name Felicia H. She wrote, "I need to see you this week. It is not a small matter." Felicia Hargrove had practiced family and civil law in Memphis for 19 years and kept an office on Union Avenue that smelled faintly of good coffee and older books. She was 55, methodical, unhurried, and had known Simone since the closing on the bungalow, when Simone had been 29 and careful, and Felicia had recognized in her a certain quality of attention that she associated with clients who did not create problems. They met on a Tuesday morning. Simone brought the folder. Felicia reviewed it without expression. When she finished, she set it on the desk and looked at Simone steadily. She said, "You have documentation of the transfers?" Simone said she had the bank records, the dates, and the email confirmations for 3 of the transactions. Felicia said, "And the property trust? He has no legal interest in that structure?" Simone said he had never been named in it and had never been invited to be. Felicia said, "Then your exposure is limited and your position is clean." She said it the way she said all things, without drama, as a statement of fact. Then she said, "What I want you to understand is that what you heard at that party is not legally actionable on its own. What matters is what he does next and whether he is given the opportunity to do it." Simone said, "I have no intention of giving him that opportunity." Felicia said she would begin drafting the necessary documents that afternoon. Some things you don't say twice. You say them once and you move. She drove from Felicia's office to Orange Mound, to the house where her grandfather sat in his chair by the front window, with a newspaper folded in his lap, and the slow, watchful patience of a man who had outlasted a great many situations by refusing to be hurried by any of them. She sat across from him and told him what she had heard at the party. She said it plainly, without embellishment. Ernest listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I knew that man was reading the property the way a speculator reads land." He said it without anger. He said it the way he said everything, as an observation drawn from a long life of watching people and what they wanted. He said, "Your grandmother used to say, a person who loves you asks about you. A person who wants something from you asks about what you have." Simone sat with that for a moment. Then her grandfather said, "There is something else you should know." He said that 2 months ago Derek had called him, that he had asked, in the casual, sideways manner of someone trying not to appear direct, how the trust was structured and whether it transferred to a spouse upon marriage. Ernest had told him the trust was managed privately and that he was not in a position to discuss its terms. He had not told Simone because he had not wanted to poison the engagement on a suspicion. She looked at her grandfather's hands, big and worn and entirely still in his lap. She said, "You should have told me." He said, "I know it. I'm telling you now." She drove home, and she did not stop for anything along the way. She went inside, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she looked at the backsplash tile she had laid by hand, and she thought about what it meant to build something that held, and what it meant to have let a person stand in the middle of it who had been measuring the dimensions the entire time. By Thursday, she had what she needed. Felicia's contact, a financial investigator named Douglas, who worked quietly on civil matters, had spent 48 hours running the background Simone had requested. What he returned to her was more than she had expected and exactly what the pattern had predicted. Derek had done this before. 5 years ago. In Nashville, there had been a woman named Carlene who had been a commercial real estate broker with a mid-sized portfolio. Derek had been engaged to her for 11 months. The engagement had ended 2 months after her firm folded in a market correction, and the assets she had been positioned to inherit from her father had been restructured into a trust that excluded spouses by explicit design. He had broken the engagement by phone. The documentation ran to 4 pages. Simone read it twice. She added it to the folder. She had spent her career in logistics, which meant she had spent her career understanding that a shipment moved most efficiently when every variable was accounted for before the truck left the dock. You did not discover a missing document at the delivery point. You verified before departure. She was verified. That evening, Derek came to the bungalow for dinner, as he did on Thursdays, and she made the pasta he liked and set the table the way she always set it, and asked about his week with the same calm attention she had always given him. He was relaxed. He was easy in the way a man is easy when he believes he is 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room. He brought her flowers, which he did occasionally, a mixed bunch from the grocery store, and she thanked him and put them in a vase and set them on the counter where the evening light touched them. He was performing for an audience that only existed in his own head. She watched him the way she watched systems under observation, with the detached and total attention of someone who no longer needed the outcome to be a particular thing, but simply needed to understand what it was. He was careful with her that evening, attentive in a calibrated way, asking about her week and listening to the answers with visible interest. He talked about the wedding, about venue ideas, about whether they had thought enough about the guest list. Every business she had ever run had taught her that a person who becomes more attentive at a moment of pressure is a person who has sensed pressure. She asked about the Nashville conference he had mentioned attending the following month. He described it in detail, smooth and specific, supplying the name of the hotel and the keynote speaker and the colleagues who would also be in attendance. She listened and nodded and refilled his water and said nothing. After he left, she washed the dishes and put them away and went to bed and slept without difficulty. Preparation is the work. The meeting happened on a Saturday morning at Felicia's office, 2 weeks after the party. Simone had called Derek the evening before and told him there were some matters related to the wedding planning that her attorney needed to walk through with both of them. A formality involving property disclosures her grandfather's trust required before a marriage could proceed. Derek had agreed without hesitation. He arrived at the office carrying the particular confidence of a man who believed he was being walked toward what he had been building toward for 3 years. Felicia's conference room held a table, 6 chairs, and very little else. When Derek came in, he found Felicia at the head of the table. He found Douglas to one side with a bound report in front of him. He found Simone's cousin, Adaize, who was an attorney herself and had driven down from Nashville that morning. He found Ernest Akebi in the chair by the window, moving slowly and sitting with complete composure. He found Simone at the far end of the table with a folder and her hands resting quietly in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved around the room once, and Simone watched something recalibrate behind them. He said, smiling carefully, "This is quite a group." Simone said, "Please sit down." He sat. He did not have an attorney with him because he had not been told he would need one. Felicia set down the first document, the bank transfer records, $11,200 over 31 months. She explained each transaction with the precision of someone who had organized the information specifically to be explained clearly. Then, Douglas set down his report. He turned to the page that described the engagement to Carlene Moss in Nashville. He read the relevant section aloud, without inflection, the way professionals read documents that are meant to be understood rather than felt. Derek's expression passed through several stages. Simone watched it the way she watched freight exceptions on a tracking board, noting each shift without reaction. He said, that situation was completely different. He said Carlene had misrepresented things to him. He said people made choices that looked bad in retrospect. He said Simone knew him. She knew who he actually was, and none of this reflected what was between them. Ernest said, from the chair by the window, without raising his voice or turning his head, what is between them is a folder on that table. That is what is between them now. Derek looked at Simone. His expression moved into something softer, searching. The expression of a man locating the instrument he had used before and finding it in his hand. He said, Simone, everything I feel for you is real. Whatever else you think you know, you have to believe that. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, I heard you in that hallway, Derek. I heard every word. You wanted to make sure I trusted you. I want you to know that I did. For a long time, I did. That trust belonged to me and I gave it to you, and you handled it the way this folder says you handle things. She stood. She said, you had 3 years to see who I was. You saw the Civic and the pearl earrings, and you decided you understood the complete picture. You never asked about the work. You never asked what I had built. You only asked my grandfather about what you might one day be able to take. She picked up the folder. She said, I am not angry. I am clear. Those are very different things, and I need you to understand that the trust you spent 3 years positioning yourself to access is structured in a way that no marriage, no legal instrument, and no amount of patience on your part was ever going to reach. My grandfather built it that way before I was old enough to know why. Now I know why. She walked to the door. She said, without turning, Felicia will provide you with the dissolution paperwork for the engagement. I'd like it returned signed by the end of the month. She walked out. The morning air on Union Avenue was cool and smelled faintly of coffee from the bakery 2 doors down. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. She was done. 10 months later, Simone sat on the back porch of the bungalow in the early morning, her coffee in her hand, and the garden she had put in that spring running along the back fence in full summer color. She had planted salvia and black-eyed Susans and a row of tomatoes that her grandfather had started from seed in his kitchen window and brought to her in April in small plastic cups. Careful as anything. She had expanded her role at the firm in February, taking on regional oversight for 3 additional distribution centers. A portfolio shift that came with a title change and a number at the bottom of her new contract that reflected, at last, what she had been worth to the operation for several years. Her attorney had reviewed the terms before she signed. Everything was in order. There was a man named Calvin who appeared in her life quietly, the way good things sometimes did, through a mutual colleague who had simply said, I think you two would understand each other. He was a civil engineer who had grown up in Memphis and returned to it after graduate school with the deliberate intention of someone who knew what he was choosing. He asked about her work and listened to the answers. He had come to the bungalow once and walked through it slowly and said, This tile is really something, and she had said, I laid it myself. And he had looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at her and said, Of course you did. He was not the center of her life. He was simply present in it, and his presence had the quality of something that had been measured carefully before being set in place. She had heard through a daisy that Derek had left Memphis in the spring. He was working for a smaller firm in Knoxville. a significant step down from the position he had held. Carlene Moss, the woman in Nashville, had filed a civil claim against him the previous autumn that had reached a settlement in March. His professional references, a daisy had heard, had grown complicated. Simone registered these facts the way she registered freight reports that no longer required her attention. She noted them. She moved on. The tomatoes her grandfather had started were coming in now, heavy on the vine, splitting at the seams with their own weight. She would bring some to Ernest on Sunday when she called. He had asked last week how the garden was doing, and she had told him it was doing exactly what she had planted it to do. She sat in the morning, quiet, and held her coffee, and watched the light move across the yard she maintained, and the fence she had repainted in April, and the garden she had built from seed. She had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.